Conrad has been the federal public defender for the District of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island since 2005. She became an assistant federal defender in 1992 after working as a trial attorney for the Committee for Public Counsel Services, the Massachusetts State Public Defender's Office. She is a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers and a recipient of the Boston Bar Association's John G. Brooks Award for representation of indigent clients. After graduating from Harvard Law School, she clerked for the Honorable Raya W. Zobel of the U.S. District Court in Boston. She earned a bachelor's degree in journalism from Northwestern University and worked as a newspaper reporter at the Miami Herald and the Kansas City Times before attending law school. Miriam, you're on.
Okay. Do I have the ability to screen share here?
Yes, you do.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for that introduction, David. And that invocation was just such a perfect lead-in to what I'd like to talk about. The quote about from Martin Luther King about the arc of the bending toward justice is one of my very favorite ones, and sort of is one of the things that keeps me going in a job that can be incredibly frustrating and disappointing. As one of my colleagues once said to a judge, I'm a federal public defender. Losing is what we do. So the part of what keeps us going is also redefining victory. So I'd like to start out by, I hope this little experiment will work, but I'd like to start out by telling you about one of my clients. I have been involved in some high-profile cases, most of which I can't talk about. But the bread and butter of what we do is drug cases, gun cases, immigration, bank robbery, some fraud. But we see a lot of drugs and gun cases. So this is one that you might call typical, except in many ways, including some fairly depressing ways. But I want to tell you about this client, and then I'm going to ask you in the chat just to chat with me and tell me what sentence you think this person should get. Keeping in mind the themes of forgiveness, but also that there are themes of retribution built into our criminal justice system. So my client is now about 30 years old, but he was born in a pretty poor family. His mother became involved, meaning sexually involved, with his father when she was 11 and his father was 28. They both had long histories of mental illness on both sides of their families, that is, the parents. The father was a gang leader and also a drug dealer. My client exhibited signs of mental illness from a very early age. By the time he was 9, he had been twice hospitalized for mental illness and had tried to jump out of a window when he was 4 years old. He had behavioral problems in school. At the age of 12, he was charged criminally in the juvenile system with threatening a teacher with a pencil and was put in the custody of Massachusetts Department of Youth Services, which is basically juvenile jail, or what we like to call jail for kids. At that point, his mother was pretty much washed her hands of him, and he was pretty institutionalized for much of the rest of his life. When he was 18, he was present during a shooting. He was not the shooter. He went to prison for 5 years. When he came out, he sold drugs to an undercover informant, a small amount of drugs, and he was in federal court for that, and he went to prison for 18 months. After he got out for prison for that, he sold $600 worth of cocaine to another informant, and he became my client. While he was in jail, he was a gang member. While he was in jail, he had large gang tattoos all over him, his face, his neck. He was involved, was a participant, I should say, in 3 separate assaults on other inmates, which were videotaped, in which you can see him punching someone who's on the ground unconscious. He was facing sentencing. In fact, he did not have any history of domestic violence. The only violence on his record was the assault on the teacher and being present at the shooting. But then again, we had the 3 assaults in jail that he was not charged with. During the pendency of the case, he sent a really reprehensible and threatening letter to the prosecutor. And then he immediately apologized after that. So he was prosecuted for that as well. But when I was representing him on the first sentencing, I was only representing him for the drug sale, $600 worth of cocaine, about 10 grams of cocaine. So the threats was not part of that. That was addressed separately. So what do you think? The maximum sentence was 30 years. I'm not going to tell you what the sentencing guidelines were because that was a subject of some dispute. But assume you could sentence him to any type of sentence. What would you sentence him to? And just chat to me because I want to be able to look at the responses. I don't want people to look at each other's work. I want your own individual response.
May we ask questions?
Please.
You are asking us to make a judgment on the $600 drug deal as if we didn't know anything else?
No, you know everything. You know everything, but the threats is going to be addressed separately. So that part should not affect your sentence. The assaults in jail can affect your sentence.
I don't think we can send the message just to you, Miriam.
Oh, really?
We're working on that.
Send it the way.
Maine, if you can make Miriam the host, I think you can do that.
All right. I mean, I'm fine with you sending it to everybody, and then I don't have to read them off. But, I just think that folks might be influenced by what each person thinks.
So my opinion is that the drug laws in this country are harsh and they unfairly biased. White people over people of color in the way they're meted out, and that I would give him a suspended sentence.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Len. I think drugs should be a health concern, not a criminal concern, but drugs are a criminal concern now. This defendant, it seems to me what he's really lacking is mental health care, and $600 worth of drug sales, since it is a criminal, I think there should be some sentencing just in the interest of fairness. So I'd say 2 years, but what he really needs is he needs to get directed into a program that hopefully can rehabilitate him so that he can start to live as a legitimate member of society rather than continue on the path that he's been his entire life.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Is to serve on diversion, and we could give mandatory counseling as your sentence. Mental health counseling, whatever kind of counseling we thought the person needed. So I always thought that was a good way to go.
Anyone else?
I agree with Kathy's last comments.
Hey, Bradley, you're on mute.
I would just arbitrarily, for the reasons that whoever said 2 years, I'd go to 3, but I'd be not, I would not want to punish beyond that. And I don't know what help we can get him.
Does anybody else want to weigh in before I tell you what the prosecutor asked for and what the outcome was?
I would just say that putting him in jail doesn't really accomplish anything. It doesn't help anyone, frankly, and just costs society some money. And I'm not sure what kind of help we can get for him for mental health, but also the $600 is such a small amount that putting a guy in jail for that doesn't make sense to me.
Anyone? So the prosecutor asked for 18 years. 18 years. That would cost about $39,000 a year to keep him in prison. I asked the judge for time served, which was at that point about 2.5 years, and that's what the judge did. For various reasons having to do with an appeal, the prosecutor appealed the sentence, and it came back before the judge, and the judge did the exact same thing again. In the interim, my client had gone to a maximum security prison, U.S. penitentiary at Hazleton, where Whitey Bulger was murdered. And despite the fact that it is known as Misery Mountain, despite the fact that he was incarcerated during a pandemic and was at risk because he is severely obese, he managed not to have a single disciplinary infraction during the entire time he was at that penitentiary, because he knew he might be coming back in front of the judge. He had a daughter who was born while he was in jail, and all he wanted was to go home to his daughter. And he did, and he's been doing very well. He has mandatory counseling. But as you can probably tell, both from my tone and from your comments, I thought it was an absolute disgrace that the prosecutor thought an 18-year sentence was appropriate. My client did get additional time for violating his probation on his earlier drug sale, and he got an additional 20 months for the threat, for a grand total of about 5 years. And he came home in February. He's working, and he's taking care of his daughter, and so far, so good. Anyway, I think it's an illustration of the problems of mass incarceration. And one of you, I think it was Len, talked about racial bias in the enforcement of the drug laws. So I just want to share with you some information that relates to that. And hopefully I can do the technology here. So this was from about 2 years ago. As an article in the New York Times, crime rates have been going down steadily over the last 10, 15 years, but incarceration rates remain among the highest in the world. And this is a picture, a visualization of that. So out of every country in the world, this is not number of prisoners, this is rates of incarceration. The United States outstrips every country in the world, including Russia, China, by a long shot, and so forth. What we consider, other, not just what we consider civilized countries, but third world countries as well. The prison population, one of the things that I like about this chart, and I'm kind of a numbers and statistics nerd. So I look at this, and I graduated from law school in 1987, which was just when things started to rise. But my entire career, 30 years as a public defender, has seen this astronomical increase that is only recently starting to come down. And if you look at the racial breakdown of the incarcerated population, now I should point out, when I say incarcerated, I mean people held before trial as well as sentenced prisoners. The difference between the proportion of the population that is white and the proportion of the incarcerated population that is white is very, very disparate. And I want to share with you another graphic, which to me is just shocking, which is that the lifetime likelihood of a black man born in 2001 being imprisoned is 1 in 3. whereas for all men, it's 1 in 9. For white men, it's 1 in 17. So essentially, it's more than 5 times as likely that a black man will go to prison. And of course, the numbers are also disparate for Latino men, but not quite as much. Now, one of the reasons for that, but not the only reason, is the disparate treatment of people by police. So this studies have shown that Black and Hispanic drivers are more likely to be stopped by police, but if they're stopped by police, they're also more likely to be searched by police. Now, you would think, well, if they're searched, if they don't have anything, then they're let go, no harm, no foul. But actually, studies have shown that the chance of a Black driver having something illegal, if they're searched, is actually in most places somewhat lower than the chances of a white driver having something illegal. And so this is really how bias, implicit bias or otherwise, affects the mass incarceration that we see of people of color. Now, there are lots of other ways that it plays out. One is the use of minimum mandatory sentences. Another is decisions made by prosecutors. For example, in the case of the client that I told you about at the beginning, there was an enhancement filed based on his prior drug conviction. That was something that they didn't have to file, but they chose to file. So even in investigations, for example, there have been a number of these so-called reverse sting cases. Those are cases in which the investigators, law enforcement, either offers to sell drugs to someone or they try to get them involved in some other type of crime. And they are overwhelmingly Black and Latino. There have been a number of cases litigating whether that is a constitutional violation, but so far they have not been tremendously successful. Again, maybe this is overkill or, repetitive, but the arrest rates by race show a huge disparity in terms of the arrests per 100,000 people who are Black for drug cases versus who are white, even though studies show that drug use and sales is equally common among Blacks and white. One study showed that, I think it was in New York, Black men were 3 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana charges than white men. Black defendants are more likely to be held in custody, which also in turn makes it more likely that they will plead guilty. And I have pushed back, I have pushed this issue in our districts, and one of the responses is, well, there are different types of crimes. That is sometimes true, but it's not always true. And so this doesn't, I should put the caveat in here that it doesn't necessarily, this doesn't control for what the crime's charged, but this is not just federal cases, this is nationally. So that could include violent crimes that we don't normally see in federal court, where both Black and white defendants are charged. Oops. Plea offer types differ between white and Black defendants in terms of whether they go to jail or not, and the length of the sentence. There's a stark disparity between Black and white defendants. Now, we talked a little before about mental illness, and mental illness is widespread in the jail population nationally. And it's just, it always strikes me, especially, for example, in the case that I mentioned at the beginning, that prosecutors seem to think that the answer to someone who has mental illness is to warehouse them in a jail. we were able to show in that particular case through various experts and various studies that being in prison, not surprisingly, makes mental illness worse. And this particular client, by the way, when he served his most recent sentence, he spent almost all of that time in solitary confinement. Not because he had committed some kind of infraction, but because an infraction had occurred in the prison, and as a result, everyone was on lockdown. There were lockdowns to prevent the spread of COVID, which at least fortunately he did not contract COVID. But studies have shown that solitary confinement can create mental illness and certainly can aggravate mental illness. In fact, I think it's Human Rights Watch has, or maybe it's Amnesty International, has called solitary confinement a human rights violation, but it is widely used throughout the prison system, including the federal prison system. Again, not surprisingly, the jail population is, about 7 times more likely to have substance abuse disorders. And until very recently, medical treatment, that is medication to treat substance abuse, has not been widely available in prisons. This creates a really dangerous situation, because what happens is someone gets arrested, they've been using, they have reached a certain tolerance, they go to jail, they go into withdrawal, which is very unpleasant. If they get out, they think they can start using where they left off, but they've lost their tolerance. And there's a higher rate of overdoses after incarceration than among the population that's not incarcerated. There's been some progress made towards providing medically assisted treatment, which has been shown to be very effective. But there's been a mindset that, well, you're just giving them more drugs. You're actually treating a disease, which is what substance abuse is. There is a pretty good drug treatment program in the federal prison system. And I don't know if this policy is still the same, but a while back I met a young man who had been in the prison system, and he was on the waiting list to get into this drug treatment program, and he was taken off the waiting list because he tested positive for drug use while he was in prison. So in other words, the fact that he was using drugs in prison was a reason not to treat him for drug addiction. And to me, that makes no sense whatsoever, and it is a continuation of this sort of punitive as opposed to treatment model of imprisonment and of approaching drug abuse. So as of 2018, the states were spending nearly $61 billion a year on imprisonment and incarceration. And I think we just have to ask, couldn't some of that money be used to provide more treatment in the community, to provide more education in the community, to provide job training, which has been employment has been shown to be one of the most significant factors in reducing recidivism. This is for federal, it's $81 billion per year total. This is the annual cost for federal prisoners is $39,000. As of February of 2020, there were almost 175,000 federal inmates, and that number has actually gone down fairly significantly. As of May 2021, there were 152. I think a lot of that is due to COVID. Both because the courts have slowed down, they're not sending as many people to prison, they're not doing as many sentencing hearings, but also there was some relief granted for people who are vulnerable to COVID as well as the federal prisons sending some people home if they did not pose, in the view of the Bureau of Prisons, a danger. The Bureau of Prisons, however, was not very, a lot of the people who got sent home, I should say, that was done through court action, not through the Bureau of Prisons. We spent a lot of time during the past year trying to get clients who were particularly vulnerable to serious outcomes if they contracted COVID to get them home. Because, of course, the prisons were not equipped to do things like social distancing. I heard stories, people were using the same mask for 3 weeks, paper masks for 3 weeks. Guards weren't masked, and they, of course, weren't able to socially distance when they're in a cell that's only 5 by 5 or 6 by 6. This is the federal population, inmate population totals, which again, they've gone down, but note that they're still above where they were in 2000. And again, of course, not surprisingly, the breakdown by race in terms of comparing it to the general population shows a very great disparity in terms of Black prisoners and white prisoners. 38% Black, 57.7% white, but that doesn't come close to the national population breakdown. And Hispanic also, largely because there are so many federal prisoners who are in prison for immigration violations. So that is what I've got in terms of my talking points. I probably have talked more than I was supposed to, but that's what trial lawyers do, is they like to talk. So I'm happy to answer any questions or engage in any other way that folks would be interested in.
Miriam, thank you. You did not talk longer than our speakers typically do, so you're fine on that count. That certainly was an excellent presentation, very sobering. So we'll do some questions. I think I saw Dick Booma's hand up.
Yes, Marion, I don't expect a 2-minute answer to solve this problem. But in other countries that have so much less incarceration, what do they do with violators?
I think they still send them to prison, but just not for as long. We have minimum mandatory sentences in this country that stack up very, very quickly. I don't think they have minimum mandatory sentences. I can't say I've studied them, but I have. We occasionally, the reasons are complicated, but we occasionally represent people who are serving sentences in other countries. And the sentences are just much lower. I mean, in a lot of countries, European countries, for example, someone who murders someone goes to prison for 7 years. The New York Times did an article, it's got to be at least 10 years ago, about a Norwegian prison where people lived in sort of almost like a dorm room. And they had various activities they engaged in and various programs. Our system has been designed to be punitive. And from a political standpoint, every time there's what I like to call the crime du jour, whether it's back when I started, drunk driving, sex offenses in the early 2000s, drugs in the 1980s and into the 90s. I mean, that never really stopped, the war on drugs. But there's this kind of race to the bottom of how harsh can we make these sentences? How much can we restrict judges' discretion?
And is the belief that harder, more strict incarcerations mean people will say, oh, I'll get 10 years for this. If I only got 4, I'd do it. That sounds ridiculous to me.
Of course, that's what's called. There's two things that are literally baked into the sentencing laws. One is specific deterrence, which is also incapacitation. Well, this person, if he goes to prison for 18 years, won't be committing any crimes on the street during those 18 years. And another aspect of that is, well, maybe when he gets out, he'll think twice before he commits another crime. And I'm sorry to use the pronoun he, although most of them are he. But general deterrence, the idea is, well, other people will see that you can get this type of crime, this type of sentence for a particular crime, and they won't do it. And you're absolutely right. I don't think that people engage in that type of cost-benefit analysis. For one thing, they don't think they're going to get caught. So the question is less, what's my prison sentence going to be, and more, am I going to get caught? There is a phenomenon I've seen, not as much lately because the state sentences have gotten worse, but what I like to refer to as sticker shock. When someone who's been around the block a few times in state court gets into federal court and they find out that they're facing a 15-year minimum mandatory sentence. The problem with those types of sentences also is what happens on the other end. What happens when the person gets out of prison? Because most people are going to get out of prison eventually. If you've been in federal prison for 18 years, when you get out, you don't have family support, you don't have job skills. It's extremely difficult for someone who's been in prison for that long to literally adapt to the outside world. They're just institutionalized. And I had a client one time who had been in prison for 13 years. He'd been in prison for most of his life, and he got out. And he was like a big, tough guy. You know, I mean, he was really he had a very tough veneer. And he was trying to do the right thing. He'd gotten a job. He bought a truck. He wanted to, because he thought then he could get better work. And his truck broke down, and he was literally in my office sobbing like a baby because he couldn't cope. He didn't have the life skills to figure out, and I had to talk him through it and say, okay, let's figure out how we can get the truck towed. Then let's figure out what you can do about your job. Let's break it down step by step. You're basically warehousing people, and you're also affecting their families. There's a study that showed that even if the annual cost of imprisonment is $81 billion, that's just the government cost. There are hidden costs to families who, go on welfare. There are people because they don't have a breadwinner in the home, social services, what they have to pay for transportation, putting money into the client's account, phone calls, which are charged at an outrageous rate because there are companies that make money off of this. So anyway, sorry, that's probably not totally responsive to your question and more than you bargained for. So happy to hear from someone else or if you want to follow up.
Carol.
Yeah, Miriam, I'm wondering why, and I think I know the answer to this, why don't judges mandate substance use disorder counseling for inmates?
They usually, so they can't mandate it for inmates. They can mandate it for when they come out, and most of them do. There's pretty much mandatory drug testing. They can recommend it, but the Bureau of Prisons and the state prisons, they have all these budget limitations. So here's sort of an interesting example of that. There was a study done about 5 years ago of the Federal Bureau of Prisons treatment of mentally ill prisoners. And it was done by the Office of the Inspector General, which is sort of an independent watchdog. And they found that they weren't treating people. They weren't providing sufficient treatment. There were too many people in solitary confinement and so forth, and they therefore had to provide more treatment. Well, what happened was the Bureau of Prisons had a classification system. And this is not exactly the right nomenclature, but certain levels of need were required to have mental health treatment at certain levels, where it was once a week, once a month, whatever. After they came out with this report, the number of people who are classified as having that need suddenly dropped by 30%. So the way they were budgeting for this was by essentially saying, oh, this person doesn't really need mental health treatment. I had a client once who was extremely mentally troubled. She went to prison. I represented her when she came out. The judge was angry because he had recommended mental health treatment and she hadn't gotten any. So I got the documentation from the prison where she'd been referred for treatment. And literally what they said was, we are rejecting her for treatment because she has received a lot of treatment in the past and it hasn't worked.
Like it's supposed to go away in 2 weeks or something.
Right. But the fact that you haven't been cured doesn't mean you're not in need of treatment.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Wayne, did you have a question? You're on mute.
Yeah. And mine is sort of piggybacks on Carol's a little bit. What is any drug treatment at all provided in federal prison for these folks?
Yes.
And are they put on things like Suboxone or any of those kinds of, I'll call them substitute drugs?
So there is not, the medically assisted treatment like Suboxone is not widely available in federal prison. The ACLU of Massachusetts sued on behalf of one of our clients who was on the street and before prison and was receiving that treatment and was able to get a settlement with the Bureau of Prisons. But as far as I know, it's been on a case-by-case basis. There is something called the Residential Drug Abuse Program, which is, from what I've heard from clients, a very good program. It's 500 hours. People can earn up to a year off their sentence if they successfully complete it and go to a halfway house earlier, so it's an incentive. But there are thousands of people on the waiting list, and there are a lot of disqualifications. For example, someone who's a non-citizen can't do it. Someone who has a violent crime can do it, but they won't get the year off, which means they wind up getting pressured by other inmates to not go on the wait list because they're taking a spot away from someone who might see a sentence reduction. So there are all these kind of unintended consequences, but it's not as widely as available as it should be, but it is available.
Well, I think we'll end there. Miriam, that was an excellent presentation, very sobering, but greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, and all of you have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you, Miriam.